the major topics in this unit is the Atlantic slave trade, which itself was an outcome of the Columbian Exchange. In the first two units, we discussed the institution of slavery, and slavery was by no means something new. Slavery in Africa in particular was nothing new. It's important to be aware. There's a long history in Africa of turning prisoners of war into slaves. In Unit 2, we looked at how Islam arrived in Africa through conquest in northern Africa, and trade in sub-Saharan Africa, and the arrival of Islam created new trading routes in Africa, and these trade routes carried slaves out of Africa to the Middle East. By the time Europeans arrived, African slaves had already been going to the Islamic world for a long time, for about 500 years. So Europeans came to Africa in the 1400s, and it started with Portuguese coming down the west coast of Africa. Portuguese built relationships with different groups along the coast, and this is where the Atlantic slave trade would develop from, slaves being bought and brought from Africa to plantations in Brazil. And doing this made a lot of money for Portugal. Other Europeans saw this. They saw that Portugal was making a lot of money. They decided they wanted to join in. The route the slaves took was known as the Middle Passage, and this was a 4 to 6 week boat trip below deck in cramped quarters. It's an extremely high death rate during the Middle Passage voyages, not only for the slaves but also for the crew. Many more slaves died once they arrived at their final destination due to disease. The final destination was most commonly the sugar tobacco plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean. So slaves came from Africa to America where they worked on plantations. The products that were produced on the plantations were sent back to Europe, and European goods were sent to Africa, especially firearms. And term used to describe this trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas is the triangular trade. So we had African slavery in the plantations of Brazil, more to the west in the Spanish colonies. The Spanish colonists in the Americas relied more on the labor of indigenous people as opposed to slaves. This started with the early Spanish settlers in the Caribbean. The first Spanish colonies, really the first European colonies in America, were in the Caribbean, and the system that developed in the Caribbean is known as the Encomienda System. And this system gave Spanish settlers the right to demand that indigenous people provide labor in mines or in farms. When the Spanish came to mainland America with the conquistadores, Cortez and Pizarro brought this system with them. Eventually, the Encomienda system was replaced with the repartimiento system, which limited the amount of work indigenous people had to give to certain times of the year and slightly improved the standard of living for these people. Finally, continuing with the theme of forced systems of labor, in Russia, the Mongols really left the country devastated, and a lot of free peasants had to sell themselves into being serfs on large farms.